talking about the stages of research. And this is something you'll come across, I think, very much if you start looking at textbooks, because they're often, the stages are reflected in the way the chapters are outlined in the textbooks. I want to start with this distinction, though. It comes from, I suppose it goes right back to Bell and Newby, but it's not their distinction. I mentioned Bell and Newby here, quite an old work back in the 1980s. Probably many of you weren't even born then, were you? Before you were born, 1984. I won't ask you who was and who wasn't. I'm a bit more subtle than that. I was around then, though. What Bell and Newby did, two sociologists, was look at people doing sociological research. And the question they asked was not what results did you get, but tell us the story. Tell us, with all the mistakes and the dirty bits and God knows what else in there, what you actually did, not what you wrote up in the journals later on. And essentially they were making this distinction between the normative and the descriptive approaches. The normative account is the account, if you like, of how it ought to be, how it should be. That's the normative account, how it should be done. And that's what you get in the textbooks, of course. The textbooks are telling you how you should do the research, how perfect research is done, and that's it. The descriptive account, by contrast, is an account of what actually happened, what the researchers actually did. And that's what Bell and Newby were asking their writers, their contributors to say. Not what they should have done, but what they actually did. What, you know, the compromises they made and the false starts and God knows what was in there as well. And what we find is quite a contrast there. And of course you have to be aware of that if you're doing research particularly, but if you're reading research too, this distinction is quite important. When you're doing research, you have to deal with this. What actually happens, and you may try and follow the normative account, but try is the operative word here. You may not succeed. You may have to start again in all kinds of different ways, and you have to be aware of that being flexible is part of doing research. On the other hand, when you write it up, and particularly when you write it up for journals, and if you read journal articles you'll see this, you tend to have a normative account. People, when they write up things, tend to write it in a way that reflects how they should have done it. So they miss out all the mistakes they've made, the false starts and so on, and just talk about the good bits, if you like. And recast the story in terms of, we wanted to find this out, so we did this and we found that. That's how they do it. So it isn't actually necessarily how it actually comes out. I'll talk more about that when I come back in the last session to talk about how you write up research and the different kinds of styles and approaches of writing up research. Let's look at a bit more detail of those two approaches. The normative, first of all. This is the one that might be familiar to you. If you look at a textbook, this is almost the chapters in the textbook. How do you do research? Well, you start by conceptualizing the issues. You start by thinking about what kinds of research questions you're going to address. And then you start looking at the literature to find out what's been known about this area, what theoretical ideas might be brought to bear to explain things. Perhaps even using statistical abstracts and other data that's been collected to give a ground for your work, to give some kind of starting point for what you're doing. The result of all that cogitation, that thinking at the beginning, is you come up with the research strategy. I want to find this out, and therefore I'm going to use a survey to find it out. That's your strategy. And then you select your methods. I'm going to do a survey based on an internet questionnaire. And I'm going to sample in that kind of fashion. So that's your methods. And then you organise the practicalities. You design your questionnaire and so on and so forth. Or if you're using other methods, you sort out your sampling and so on and so forth. And then you start collecting the data. In the case of an online survey, of course, that's quite simple. You simply announce it's there and people come on and do the survey. In other cases, you might have to do a lot of work here. If you're interviewing, you have to start going out and doing the interviews and recording them and collecting them and so on. So you go through and collect the data. You do your field work, as it's often referred to. And if you're doing things like interviews, you may have to transcribe it. If you're doing surveys, you might have to code the results into a computer program to analyse them, a stats package. And then you can start analysing the data. In some cases that can be pretty quick, although it might be difficult. Things like a statistical analysis often is quite quick because you press a few buttons on a computer program, it does it for you. But it can be quite complicated because it's difficult to understand what's going on. You have to understand the stats. In the case of qualitative research, data analysis can be quite lengthy. Analysing texts, analysing pictures and video takes an awful long time. You have to read things and reread them and think about them and write about them and so on. So in the analysis stage of qualitative research is very, very lengthy and very, very tedious. And then you write up your results. You analyse them and come up with some answers. You hope you come up with some answers to your research question. So you hope you go right back to the beginning to the question you've raised. You hope you've got an answer to that. Not always, of course. Lots of research comes up with no answer. It's not sufficient to answer the question, unfortunately. But if you're lucky, then your research will have answered the question, yes or no. That's happening, that's not happening, something like that. And then perhaps you report on it, you publish something, you write it up. If you're doing it for a course, obviously you write up your dissertation or whatever. But if you're doing it in other areas, you might publish the results, or you might write a final report for the people who've paid for your research. And then maybe even at the end, act on the findings. Some researchers don't do that. Some researchers simply publish and that's it. But these days there's a real move to make sure your research makes a difference. And to give you one example of that, week before last, I was in Prague at a meeting of a research group I'm a member of at the moment called the Coping Project. Coping Project is a big European-funded project. We've got 4 countries involved: Sweden, UK, Romania and Germany. And we're researching just how well children whose parents are in prison cope with that situation. How resilient are they in dealing with a situation where their parent, usually their father, but sometimes their mother, is in prison. So we've interviewed the children, we've interviewed the carers, and we've interviewed the prisoners and so on. This meeting in Prague, a large amount of it was concerned not with the results we've got. We've got the results, we've done the analysis now to a large extent, but rather we're concerned with dissemination. What do we do with the results? How do we make a difference? We're setting up a conference I think it's in Paris, where we're inviting all kinds of influential people along who might make a difference, who might take up our results and change the way that the criminal justice system works, or change the way that European governments come up with policy and so on, to make things better for the people we've been looking at, the children of prisoners. So researchers now are very often concerned not just with publishing their results, reporting on it, but with trying to act on the findings. They can't actually do anything themselves necessarily, but they can help by making sure that the government and the powers that be know about it and can do something. So that's the normative account of research. You start with some research ideas and delving into the literature and reading about things and so on, and then you go through these stages, setting out your design, your method, collecting the data, analysing it, writing it up. By comparison, the descriptive account of how things actually happen is much more messy. I call it dirty. It's a kind of messy. It's not as clear cut, not in those kind of logical stages. One thing that often happens here is that things get done in a different order. It's not simply let's have the research question first and then the design and so on. Rather, people go out and start collecting some data without any real clear research question. Now that's dangerous. To do that is something that you ought to be very careful about, because simply going out without a research question may not be helpful. But sometimes you're not very clear about what's happening, and doing some exploratory research beforehand might help clarify the research question. So doing it in that kind of way might help. So getting a research question in this kind of fashion. Emergent methods, grounded theory, for example, is an approach in which you may have a research question, but your analysis goes in stages. So you collect some data and start analysing it, and then you get some ideas about what's going on, and you might then change your research, change the kinds of questions you're asking in your interviews and so on in later interviews. Maybe interview different kinds of people because of the early results you're getting from your analysis. So it's not a clear-cut stage of collect the data, then analyse and so on. It might be a kind of a cycling around, so analyse some, cycle back, collect some more, different data and so on, and revise things as you go. Another common thing is redoing bits. I mean, the typical research program is start somewhere, have an idea about how to do it, it all goes completely wrong, you can't access that population, so you start all over again. almost with a different research question. And I know that happens. I've had several PhD students who've started their research thinking, I want to do this, and they just simply have not been able to get access to those particular respondents for their study. And therefore they have to change what they do. I mean, very often it's because the organisation they want to work with won't give them permission for their research, so you have to change what they're going to do. So being flexible and being able to revise things is not an untypical thing in research. Even if it's not the whole thing, it might be some part of it is hard to do, and you have to revise it. And starting again from the beginning because everything went wrong is an option and not unusual in research. So beware, if you take part in research of any kind at any stage, this is how life really is. It's not as simple as the textbooks tell you. It often is much more complicated. And you have to be flexible how you do things. So the key here then is following the normative approach, but don't expect to follow it to the letter. You have to be flexible about how you follow it. That's how you should be doing it. You know that's how it should happen, and there are good reasons for that. But if you have to diverge from it for other good reasons, that's fine. But always bear in mind the criteria you're trying to follow in the normative account. So good research then is careful, self-critical, but isn't necessarily following the normative programme for very good reasons. Okay, I think this is the last point I'll talk about, developing a research question. This is the first stage, if you like, of the normative account. Let me go back to that one. You see the normative account here, conceptualising the issues, getting a focus. This actually often is a very difficult problem, particularly I found for students in their final year projects. I mean, what can I research? Getting a clear question that makes sense, that is doable, that can be done with the resources they've got and so on, and can give them an answer as well. That's an important point in designing research. Will it give me answers? Lots of people can go out and do research and get all kinds of things, but actually they don't tell them anything at the end. They don't answer the research questions they've set. So getting something that's answerable, that gives them a result that can be acted upon, is quite important too. So how do we do that? How do we develop this research question? Here's some suggestions, some tips. How do we get the research area? Well, very often that's a matter of interest. I've been reading this, or I've looked at this on the news, or I had personal experience of this because when I was age so-and-so, this happened to me, etc. All kinds of reasons why we have an interest in an area. And they can be personal, they can be academic, they can be to do with what's current in the news and so on, what's important in society at that time. All kinds of reasons. Doesn't matter. Your motivation is important. As long as you've got motivation, that's great. But where that comes from doesn't really matter. But all of those things can be ways of getting ideas for research topics. The classic approach, the normative approach, if you like, says one has to do this at the beginning. One has to have a clear idea from the very start about what your research question is, because that then guides you to your strategy, your method, and so on in your design. But as I said before, that isn't always the case, and sometimes it helps to be a bit flexible here in your question. You may have a more general topic you're researching, but you're unclear about the actual question you're going to be looking at. And that's where a bit of early research comes in useful, a bit of exploratory research comes in useful. I remember years ago, Colin Robson always argued when he was talking to PhD students about doing their work, that actually he had this idea of this kind of metaphor of getting your hands dirty, going out there in the real world and getting some real data to work on can be a good way to start to help you clarify the issues in something. So it isn't always necessary simply to read the literature and to come up with a research question in the abstract before you start any data collection. His suggestion was it might just be worth going out and talking to some people, actually seeing what's happening, going in and experiencing something and looking at it and so on, observing it, to get some ideas about what's happening. So that's his notion of getting your hands dirty, the metaphor of that, of going out into the world. And a similar point made by Gruber and Lincoln. And also Strauss and Corbin, of course, in their grounded theory approach, take a similar idea that the early analysis you do on your interviews, for example, might lead you to certain ideas about what kinds of things are important here. The result of which is you change the way you sample, the kinds of individuals you look at, because you developed a new idea of what's going on. So it's quite a flexible approach. On the other hand, bear all that on your mind, there's still no harm in the normative approach of starting to try to develop a research question at the very beginning. So it's a good exercise. Don't just simply say, oh, I'm just going to be free about this and very ultimately flexible and go out and do something. It does actually help, if you can, to be clear about what you want to find out at the start. How do you do that? Well, one problem that often occurs here is people are much too broad in their question. In fact, from years of advising students in their dissertations, I can say that's the number one problem, is the research questions are enormously broad. And they're broad either in a logical sense, they cover too many different cases, too wide a range of situations, or because they include enormous populations. I want to find out about the whole of the world, everyone that's in it, and I want to know everything about them. You can't do that. That's silly. I know, it's far too broad. But actually, another way of putting it is nobody ever failed in doing research by making their research question too narrow. So when you're planning research, when you're coming up with these research questions, research issues, hypotheses, if you like, there's no harm in being as narrow as you possibly can. The more narrow, the better usually. Extremely narrow is fine, because you can always expand it a bit when you do the research itself. But having a question that's too broad to begin with means that you're trying to answer too many things at once. You're trying to, your sample is going to be too large and you need too many resources and so on and so forth. It's unfocused. Secondly, you need to know the background literature. You need to have read something. Otherwise, you're in danger of simply repeating what somebody else has already done. There'll be some paper published 2 years ago that did exactly the same thing you're proposing to do, and they've answered the question. So why do it again? Well, actually, there might be reasons for doing it again, but you need to know about that. You need to know that thing was published. Therefore, you need to know that literature. It might also be that there are ideas in the literature, there are theoretical ideas, there are design ideas that you could use in your research. Somebody else has done something similar and they used this design to do it. They gathered data from these kinds of people in this kind of way. Or maybe they designed a questionnaire of this kind that you can use, some kind of scale that they might have got that you can use in your study. And they spent a lot of time making sure that scale was valid and reliable and so on and so forth. In which case, you can borrow it and use the same scale. And there are good reasons for doing that. So for all kinds of reasons, knowing what's been published is very good to avoid repeating the obvious. You need to go out and make sure, and this is, I suppose this repeats the point I made just now about making sure that you that you can actually get access to the situation. Keeping on board the group decisions when you're a group of researchers, but it might also apply to your respondents too, to make sure they all keep on board. The last thing you want to do is lose respondents as you go through your study, so make sure they all know what's going on. But if it's in some kind of real situation you're going to do your research, then your sponsors, the people you're working with in the organisation, the managers there perhaps, or the people in charge, as well as the people you're going to be researching, all need to be kept on board and know what's happening in the research so you can develop the thing on further. And of course the real danger here is that you don't get permission to study, and that's the real bugbear of research at this stage, is not being able to get access to the respondents you want to talk to. So make sure you keep them on board if you can. It helps to have a personal stake, and this is one of those things where it's good and bad at the same time. I mentioned earlier on about one of the sources of research ideas is having some kind of personal experience. And often people have experience of something they've done when they were younger, they did so and so, and I don't know, let's say being a single mum, that's something they did a few years ago and they had a child, and then I want to research that in some way. That's great because it gives you a real insight into the issues. It also gives you a lot of motivation because you've been through the same kind of thing, so you know what's going on. And all of those are good plus signs. So that helps. So having some kind of interest, some kind of personal stake in it and so on can help research and can help motivation and the understanding of what's going on. On the other hand, you've got to be very careful because you can be biased. You're biased because your personal experience might bias you. You know, as a single mum, things went very fine, went very, very well. You had a great period, quite great time. The child was wonderful and well behaved and doing well at school and so on and so forth. That was great. But that isn't always the case. That might bias you to see things in that kind of way. Or it might be that you have a bee in your bonnet about something. You know, there's something that went wrong that you must, I want to make sure those bloody midwives, they did it wrong, they should have been there and they weren't and so on. So you're down on midwives and that biases your results again because you are overcritical of those things. So there are plus signs and there are plus points and there are minus points about being involved and having some kind of personal stake in things. It can be great to give you motivation and give you interest, but beware it might bias you either positively or negatively in the research you're doing. But above all, last point in getting the question, be realistic. The whole point about a research question is it has to be doable. It has to be something that you can do with the resources you have. And if it's a project you're doing on your own as part of a course, it's got to be something you can do in the time you've got with just you doing it. So it can't be too large a sample, for example. In other cases, it's whatever time period you've got and whatever funding you have to do the work. And so it's got to be doable in that sense. It's got to make sense. You've got to be realistic about what you can achieve in that time period. And again, thinking narrow, back to the point at the top, having a narrow question is often a help there. Narrow questions are easier to do in the fixed time you often have to do research.